On a dry morning in April 1973, in Garfield County, Kansas, a man named Walter Griggs stood at the edge of a field that wouldn't stop fighting him. The wind came first. Always the wind. It rolled across the prairie in long, invisible waves, lifting topsoil like it weighed nothing, carrying it east in thin brown sheets that scraped across fence posts and settled in ditches miles away. Walter had watched that same wind peel 3 inches of good earth off his north field over the last 5 seasons. Good soil, black soil, the kind his father used to scoop up in his hands and call money you could plant. Now it drifted. Behind him sat a 1949 Farm LM row crop tractor, red paint faded to something closer to rust in color, its 38 horsepower engine idling low and steady, like it had something to say, but didn't need to raise its voice to say it. Walter had bought that machine secondhand in 1956 for $1,200 in Finney County. His father had called it expensive. His neighbors called it outdated. Walter just called it reliable. Across the dirt road, 3 pickup trucks were parked in a line. Men leaned against them, coffee in hand, watching him. Younger men. Most of them had switched to newer equipment. John Deere 4020s, 95 horsepower, power steering, cabs that kept the dust out. They farmed bigger now, faster, cleaner, and every one of them had done the same thing to their land. They'd cleared the rocks. Let me tell you about those rocks. They weren't small, not pebbles, not something you could rake up in a weekend. These were glacial leftovers, some of them the size of a truck tire, others as wide as a kitchen table. They had worked their way to the surface over decades, pushed up by frost and time, scattered across the fields like the land had decided it didn't want to be farmed anymore. Every farmer in Garfield County had cursed them. Every farmer had spent years hauling them out, piling them into trucks, dumping them in ravines. Some even paid to have them hauled away entirely. Clean fields meant faster planting, straighter rows, less wear on machinery. That was the logic. Walter had followed that same logic for 30 years, until he stopped. He bent down now, brushing his hand across one of the stones at his feet. Flat, dense, heavy enough that it took 2 men to lift it into a truck bed. He didn't lift it. He just rested his palm there for a moment, like he was remembering something. Behind him, a voice called out, "You planning on farming that rock this year, Walter?" Laughter followed. Not cruel, not exactly, but loud enough. The man who said it was Dale Mercer, 36 years old, owned 1,200 acres outright and leased another 800. Drove a brand new John Deere 4020 he financed for $14,500 the previous fall. He was doing well. Everyone knew it. He took a sip of coffee and shook his head, smiling. You could have cleared that whole field in a week with the right equipment. Walter stood up slowly. His joints didn't move fast anymore. 71 years of Kansas, weather had a way of settling into a man's bones. "I could have," he said. He didn't look at Dale, just looked back out across the field. Another gust of wind swept through. You could see it this time. A faint brown haze lifting off the surface and sliding away. Dale watched it too, then shrugged. "That's farming out here." Walter nodded once. "It is." Then he did something that made the men across the road quiet down. He walked over to the farmel, climbed up into the seat, and turned the wheel just enough to line the tractor up alongside a row of rocks he'd already dragged into place. A long, uneven line that cut across the field like a scar. "What are you doing with those?" someone asked. Walter didn't answer right away. He eased the tractor forward, the engine pulling steady, chain clinking behind him as it tightened around another buried stone. Then he said it, almost to himself, "Building something that stays." The laughter came back, louder this time. Dale set his coffee on the hood of his truck and stepped closer to the ditch, watching Walter drag the rock into line with the others. "You're building a wall," he called out. "Out here." Walter stopped the tractor, let the engine idle, turned just enough to face them. "Yes." There was a pause, then the kind of laugh that spreads. One man chuckles, another joins in, and suddenly it's a group decision. "A wall's not going to stop Kansas wind," Dale said, shaking his head. "You'd need a mountain for that." Walter climbed down from the tractor, walked back to the line of stones, adjusted one with his boot. "Maybe," he said. He didn't argue, didn't defend it, didn't explain, and that made it worse. Because men like Dale Mercer knew how to argue. They knew how to win a conversation. They had numbers, yields, equipment specs, bank statements. Walter just had time. And whatever he was thinking, he wasn't sharing it. Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you had already decided you were wrong? Not just disagreed. Decided. That's where Walter stood that morning. Not in the middle of a debate. At the end of one he hadn't been invited to. Dale picked his coffee back up and took a long drink, still watching. "You're wasting time," he said finally. "Planting's 2 weeks out." Walter nodded again. "I know. And you're spending it stacking rocks." Another pause. Walter looked out over his field, then back at the line he'd started. It wasn't much yet, maybe 40 yards long, 2 feet high in places, crooked, but it was something. "My father never threw them away," he said. Dale frowned. "Your father farmed half the acres you do." Walter didn't respond. Instead, he walked back to the tractor, climbed up, and eased the throttle forward again. The Farmel M answered the same way it always had. No hesitation, no complaint, just a steady pull as the chain tightened, and another buried stone broke free from the ground. The wind picked up again, stronger this time. Dust lifted, and as the men watched, that line of rocks grew by one more piece. Dale shook his head, but he didn't leave, because something about the way Walter moved, slow, certain, unbothered, didn't look like a man making a mistake. It looked like a man finishing something he'd already decided on a long time ago. And that's when the first crack in the certainty started to show. Because by the time planting season arrived 2 weeks later, Walter Griggs had done something no one in Garfield County had ever seen before. And nobody, not even Dale Mercer, understood what it was going to do. By May of 1973, the wall stretched nearly the full length of Walter Griggs' Northfield, just over 640 yards from end to end, running perpendicular to the prevailing southwest wind that had defined farming in Garfield County for generations. It wasn't straight. It wasn't uniform. Some sections stood 3 feet high, others barely 18 inches. But it was continuous, a line of stone that looked less like construction and more like something the land itself had pushed up in protest. And people came to see it. Pickup trucks slowed along the dirt road. Farmers leaned out their windows, staring as they passed. Some stopped, some laughed, some just shook their heads and drove on, already dismissing it as another old man's stubborn idea. Dale Mercer came back more than once. He stood at the edge of the field one afternoon, hands on his hips, looking at the wall like it had personally offended him. "You're going to lose planting days over this," he said. Walter was greasing the front axle of the Farmel, a rag tucked into his back pocket. He didn't look up. "Already have," he said. "And you're fine with that?" Walter wiped his hands slowly, then finally turned. "Depends what I get back." Dale let out a short laugh. "You're not getting anything back. It's a pile of rocks, Walter." Walter nodded. "It is." But he didn't move to explain further. "Let me tell you about the Farmel M. Built between 1939 and 1952, it was one of the most successful tractors International Harvester ever produced. 4-cylinder engine, about 38 horsepower at the drawbar. No cab, no electronics. Just steel, fuel, and a design simple enough that a man with a wrench and patience could keep it running for decades. Walters had logged over 9,000 hours by 1973. The original engine block was still intact. He'd rebuilt the carburetor twice. Replaced the clutch in 1964. That was it. Machines like that didn't break down often. They just wore in. There's a difference. Walter trusted that tractor the way some men trusted bank accounts, because it had never surprised him. Dale, on the other hand, trusted numbers. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his truck and walked over, holding it out. "I ran the comparison," he said. "Your field versus mine. Same crop, same planting window. You're already down at least 8% yield just from delayed seeding." Walter glanced at the paper, but didn't take it. "Maybe," he said. "Not maybe. That's what it is." Walter folded the rag in his hands. "Slow and precise." "And if it's not?" he asked. Dale shook his head. Then I'll come out here and stack rocks with you myself. There it was. Not just doubt. A challenge. Walter's eyes stayed steady. I won't need the help, he said. Dale smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We'll see. Planting began 3 days later. Dale's fields went in first. Straight rows, uniform spacing, the 4,020 moving at a pace Walter's farmel couldn't match even on its best day. He finished his entire acreage in 4 days. Walter took 8. The wall slowed everything down. He had to work around it, adjust his passes, double back in places where the stones forced him off a straight line. It wasn't efficient, not by any modern standard. And people noticed. They'll choke his yield, someone said at the co-op in town. He's farming like it's 1945. Another added. Dale didn't say much. He didn't need to. The numbers were already on his side. But something about the way Walter moved through that field, steady, deliberate, unhurried, stayed with him. Have you ever watched someone do something inefficient on purpose and realize you didn't understand why? That's what bothered Dale, because inefficiency in his world meant loss. And Walter didn't look like he was losing anything. By mid-June, the difference between the two fields was clear. Dale's corn came up fast, even rows, strong, early growth, the kind of stand that made bankers comfortable. Walter's was uneven. Near the wall, the rows looked thicker, denser, but farther out. Patches showed where the wind had scoured the soil before germination. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't impressive either. Dale drove out one evening and parked along the road again. He didn't bring coffee this time, just stood there looking. You see it? He called out as Walter shut down the tractor nearby. Walter walked over. See what? He asked. Dale pointed. Your stand. It's inconsistent. You've got gaps. Walter followed his finger, nodded. I do. And that wall didn't stop anything. Walter looked at the line of stones, then at the rows closest to it. They're not done growing, he said. Dale let out a breath through his nose. Neither are mine. Walter smiled faintly. That's true. There was a long pause. The wind moved again, brushing across the tops of the young corn plants. You could see the difference if you looked closely. Near the wall, the plants barely moved. Farther out, they bent. Dale saw it, but he didn't say anything, because it wasn't enough yet. Not enough to prove anything. And in his mind, the season was still long. But what he didn't realize, what nobody realized, was that by the time July heat settled in and the wind came harder than it had in 5 years, that line of stones was about to change everything they thought they knew about that land. And the first sign of it came on night, when the sky turned the color of iron and the wind didn't just blow. It stayed. The storm arrived on July 18th, 1973, just after sunset. It didn't come with rain at first, just wind, a steady, building force out of the southwest that pushed against barns, rattled windows, and flattened the early tassels on young corn across Garfield County. By midnight, it had reached sustained speeds of nearly 40 miles per hour, with gusts pushing past 55. For most farmers, it was a waiting game. You couldn't stop it. You couldn't work through it. You just hoped your soil stayed where it belonged. Dale Mercer stood in his kitchen, looking out to the dark of his fields, the silhouette of his 4,020 barely visible under shed light. He'd seen storms like this before, but not this early in the season, and not this strong. By morning, the damage was already visible. Topsoil had shifted, not dramatically, but enough. You could see lighter patches where the darker earth had been stripped away. Young plants leaned hard to the northeast, some already broken at the base where the wind had hit them sideways for too long. Dale drove out before sunrise. He didn't go to his own fields first. He went to Walter's. The truck bounced along the dirt road, dust trailing behind him even in the early morning calm that followed the storm. When he pulled up and stepped out, the first thing he noticed was a silence. No wind, no movement, just still air sitting heavy over the land. Walter was already there, standing near the center of the field, hands in his pockets. Dale walked up beside him. Neither man spoke for a moment. They just looked, and what Dale saw didn't make sense. Near the wall, the corn stood straight. Not perfect, not untouched, but upright, leaves intact, Soil darkened settled around the base of each plant. Farther out, beyond about 30 yards, the pattern changed. Plants leaned. Soil lightened. Damage appeared. Dale walked closer to the wall, crouching down, running his hand across the ground. It was firm, moist, undisturbed. He stood up slowly. "How?" he asked. Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to one of the larger stones, resting his hand on it the same way he had months earlier. "Let me tell you about wind and soil. Wind doesn't just move air, it moves energy. And when that energy hits bare or loose soil, it transfers, lifts particles, carries them away. The faster the wind, the more it takes. But when that wind hits an obstacle, even something as simple as a low stone wall, it slows down, not everywhere, just immediately behind it. And that reduction, even by a small percentage, can be enough to let soil settle instead of lift, enough to let moisture stay instead of evaporate, enough to let roots hold." Walter turned back to Dale. "It doesn't have to stop the wind," he said, "just has to make it think twice." Dale stared at the wall, then back at the field. "You knew this would happen." Walter shook his head. "I hope." Dale let out a breath. "That's not the same thing." "No," Walter agreed. "It isn't." They walked the length of the wall together. In some sections, the effect was stronger than others. Where the stone stood higher, the protected zone stretched farther. Where the wall dipped, the benefit faded quicker. But the pattern was undeniable. And Dale saw it, really saw it. Have you ever been so sure of something that when it finally proves you wrong, it doesn't feel like losing? It feels like learning something you should have known all along. Dale stopped near the far end of the field, turned to Walter. "I laughed at you," he said. Walter shrugged. "You weren't the only one." Dale shook his head. "No, but I was the loudest." Walter didn't deny it. The two men stood there in the quiet that followed a storm that had changed more than just a crop. It had shifted an idea. By harvest in October, the numbers told the rest of the story. Dale's yield came in at 118 bushels per acre. Respectable. Profitable. Walter's averaged 142. Not across the entire field. The outer sections still lagged, but the protected zones, the areas influenced by that line of stone, pushed the average higher than anything Walter had produced in over a decade. Dale saw the numbers himself, did the math twice, then drove out one last time before the combines rolled. Walter was greasing the farmel again. Same rag, same motions. Dale walked up, didn't bring paper this time, didn't bring coffee, just stood there. "I was wrong," he said. Walter looked up, nodded once. "I know." There was no satisfaction in his voice, no triumph, just acknowledgement. Dale glanced at the wall, then back at Walter. "Would you show me how to build one?" Walter wiped his hands slowly, looked out across the field, then back at Dale. And what he said next wasn't what Dale expected. Walter didn't answer right away. He took his time folding the rag, tucking it back into his pocket, and glancing once more across the field that had carried him through another season. Then he looked at Dale. "I won't show you," he said. Dale blinked. "You won't?" Walter shook his head. No, there was no edge to it. No refusal meant to insult. Just a statement, delivered the same way he'd said everything else. Dale frowned slightly. "Why not?" Walter rested his hand on the side of the farmel, fingers tracing the worn metal just above the engine housing. "Because you don't need me to," he said. Dale followed his gaze to the wall stretching across the field. "It's right there," Walter continued. "Same rocks you've got. Same wind. Same soil. You already know what it does." Dale let out a quiet breath. He looked back at the wall again, this time not as something strange or misplaced, but as something obvious he had somehow missed. "I guess I do," he said. Walter nodded once. That's how most things work. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. Harvest came and went. The Farmel M pulled wagons the same way it always had, steady and uncomplaining, its engine note unchanged despite another year added to its life. Dale's 40-20 ran harder, faster, covering more ground in less time. But for the first time since he'd bought it, he found himself thinking less about speed and more about what he might be missing. By the spring of 1974, something unusual began to appear across Garfield County. Lines of stone. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But here and there, along the edges of fields, then cutting across them. Some were neat. Some were rough. Some barely stood a foot high. Others reached nearly 4. No one called them walls. They just built them. Dale's was the longest. He started in February, before the ground fully thawed, using a front loader on a newer tractor to drag and place the stones he had once paid to remove. It took him 3 weeks to complete a line just over 800 yards long, positioned almost exactly where Walter stood, angled against the prevailing wind, shaped by the contour of his land. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it, but people saw, and they understood. Let me tell you about what happened next. Over the next 5 years, average yields in that part of Garfield County didn't double-cross every acre. That's not how farming works. But in fields where those stone lines were placed correctly, farmers reported consistent increases of 10 to 18% in dry years. Soil retention improved. Moisture held longer. Crops stood stronger against wind damage. It wasn't magic. It was simple, and it had been there the whole time. Walter never expanded his wall. He didn't need to. His 640-yard line did exactly what it hoped it would do, season after season, with no maintenance beyond the occasional adjustment after a heavy rain or a shifted stone. The Farmel M kept running. In 1978, he replaced the rear tires. In 1981, he rebuilt the carburetor again. That was it. The machine outlasted trends, outlasted opinions, outlasted the idea that newer always meant better. Walter himself passed away in November of 1984 at the age of 82, peacefully, at home. His daughter, Elaine, took over the farm. She didn't change much. Didn't need to. The wall stayed. The tractor stayed. The land kept doing what it had learned to do. Dale attended the funeral. He stood near the back, hands folded, listening as neighbors spoke about a man who had never raised his voice but had somehow changed the way they all saw their own fields. Afterward, he walked out to his truck, paused, and looked across the distance where he knew Walter's land sat beyond the horizon. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to, because the lesson had already settled in. Years later, when new farmers came into the county, men and women who had never known Walter, who had grown up with larger machines, GPS-guided tractors, and yields measured down to the decimal, they still saw those lines of stone, and they asked about them. Dale was one of the ones who answered. He didn't tell the story like a man correcting a mistake. He told it like a man passing something on. He didn't stop the wind, Dale would say. He just made it slow down long enough to matter. And somewhere out there, the Farmel M still ran. Maybe not every day. Maybe not even every season. But it started. It moved. It pulled. Because it had been built to do exactly that. And the wall still stood. Stone by stone. Unimpressed by time. Unmoved by opinion. Doing its job without asking for credit. Because some things don't need to be improved. They just need to be understood. If you ever held on to something others called useless, a tool, a habit, a way of doing things, and watched it prove its worth when it mattered most, I'd like to hear about it. Those stories don't get told enough, and they deserve to be remembered. And there's another one coming, about a farmer in western Nebraska who buried a working engine for 11 years just to keep out of banks' hands. And what happened the day he dug it back up? You'll want to be here for that.